All right, so now that the main podcast is done, I am going to try to answer as many questions as you guys have put in that are feasible and that get a lot of traction. At the end of every episode, I said if you have any questions, feel free to send them to me. And oh boy, did you send me some questions. And, and so in this episode, we'll be trying to answer some of those questions. And particularly, I got a lot of questions about things like sex difference in autistic Christians and questions about LGBT issues. And initially, I was planning on talking about this in the main podcast, but I decided not to. These questions often get quite controversial. They can distract from what I was actually trying to say, and I decided that the controversy and all that really wasn't worth distracting from the main point, and it didn't really add anything to the main point of what I was trying to get across in the podcast. So I just decided to cut those episodes. However, one of the most common questions I got were questions about gender and sexuality and autistic Christian attitudes towards those various things. So overwhelmingly, I got questions like, why are autistic men the way that they are? What's going on with autistic women? Are there differences between autistic men and autistic women? Can autistic men and women coexist? We've got a few questions about how to get a girlfriend. We're not going to address that one in this episode, or probably any in the future. Other questions like, are autistic Christians more likely to accept gay people or less likely to accept gay people? And in that same vein, why are autistic Christians accepting of gay people when you explicitly said that they care about theology and being right about stuff? And other questions of that nature. And also just like, how many autistic Christians are gay? How many are straight? What are the numbers on those? And so I am going to attempt to answer those questions in this episode. And to help me answer those questions, I have brought along Maddie, who is different than Amy in that she is in the same time zone as me. So it's much easier to coordinate and much easier to record episodes. So, Maddie, if you just want to introduce yourself to the good people.
Yeah. Hi, good people. I'm Maddie. I am autistic and Christian and a woman. So I'm very qualified to be here. But mostly I'm here because I kept bothering John on Twitter. And now we get to talk about controversial things.
Yeah, so Maddie managed to transcend the parasocial relationship into a social relationship by just she's responsible for at least half these questions. I'm joking. Well, I'm sort of joking. I'm joking in a way that like she definitely did ask around half of these questions, but also a lot more than her asked those questions.
I'm not the only one.
Yeah, she isn't the only one, but she did ask a lot of them. So I said, if you want to have them answered, you have to sit on a podcast with me while I talk at you, and then you ask questions as a proxy for the audience. So that's what's going to happen, and that's what we're going to do now. Starting off, I think before we talk about gender and sexuality, we should probably define what gender and sexuality and sex are. You know, we're asking the question that is always asked in good faith and never asked with ulterior motives and always asked with complete sincerity. What is a woman or what is a man? I'm just kidding. We're not going to answer those questions. What we're going to do is just give a general working definition for sex and a working definition for gender that we are going to use for the duration of this podcast. So, for the purpose of the next few episodes where we try to address these issues, sex is what you're born with, and gender is what you are designated by yourself and by society. So that is the definition that we're going with. Now I know I'm going to get a whole bunch of emails and a whole bunch of comments, and people be like, that's not a good definition of sex, or that's not a good definition of gender. And quite frankly, you're right. But we're not going to get bogged down in those definitions because there are a lot of ways to define gender, and many of those ways are mutually exclusive and cannot be simultaneously true. And there are autistic people who have extremely strong opinions about which is the right definition and which is the wrong definition. And yeah,
And we
there's just no way of talking about these things in a way that will make everyone happy. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to bypass that debate. And whenever I say sex, I will mean it in the sense of what you're born with. And whenever I say gender, it will be whatever you designate yourself and whatever society designates you.
Mhm.
Don't email me telling me I've defined it wrong. I know I've defined it wrong. We're just going with a quick, easy, functional definition and just moving forward. So,
This would be an
yeah,
8-hour podcast if you had to redefine sex and gender every time they came up.
yeah. So, we're also not philosophers of gender or really people who care deeply about defining these things. So, we're going to use functional definitions as we use them. And so, that's what that is. Before we get into this, I will make a disclaimer. For when we're talking about sex difference in the upcoming portion of the podcast, we are only going to be talking about sex differences between cisgender autistics. Non binary autistics and trans autistics have a lot more additional factors that go into things that will mean we won't be able to cover both cisgender and transgender autistics in a timely manner that will be able to keep this podcast under 6 hours. And every single time I would have to differentiate between the two because there are just generalized differences between the different groups and between the different subsets. And while there are lots of things that are overlapping, there are lots of things that aren't overlapping. Additionally, trans issues are a very hot topic these days and are popping off in the culture wars. And a lot of people often ask me questions about trans autistics, and what they are doing is they're trying to get information that they can use as a cudgel to sort of beat trans people with. And I'm not interested in providing that ammunition to people. And if I speak about these things, I like to be very careful and very measured and make sure I say things correctly and nuance them correctly and everything like that so that I don't get misunderstood and that people who are looking to interpret me in a bad faith way won't be able to misinterpret the types of things I say. Trans people in general, and especially trans autistic Christians, have a lot of experiences that are just unique to them, and many experiences that, while maybe not unique to them, affect them in a way that is very different than their cisgender counterparts. And so there is, especially when you get to churches and Christianity, for a lot of trans people, there's a very big difference between being a cis woman in church and a trans woman in church. And while they would both fall under the same general gender category, there are just a lot of differences and a lot of nuances that if I say autistic women, I would basically be describing a huge swath of experience that covers such a huge amount of territory that it will basically take me 2 hours just to talk about that. And probably 3/4 of that time I'd be talking about trans people. And most people, when they ask me these questions, are asking about cis people. Like in the vast majority of cases, when they're asking me what are the differences between autistic men and autistic women, when it comes to Christianity or just in general, they are almost always exclusively asking me about cisgender autistics. So that's all we're going to be talking about for this episode. I am planning on doing a future episode on autistic trans people, and especially autistic trans people in the church and those various experiences. And I think they deserve their own separate episode. But in this episode, unless explicitly stated, assume that I am talking about cis people. All right. So, with that disclaimer out of the way,
That was a good one. Good disclaimer.
so autistic sex differences. So, before we even talk about autistic sex differences, we have to talk about something called socialization. So, socialization is a very big thing whenever you talk about sex difference, because sex difference isn't just a matter of biology. It's also a matter of how humans in general get treated based on these biological categories. So, in normal people speak, what that means is if you are a girl, you're going to be treated differently than if you're a boy. And there are different expectations that are placed on you by society as a girl, and different ones that are placed on you as a boy. And these change the way you behave, they change the way you think about things, the way you are raised, how you're taught to behave, the corrective social pressures that are placed on you by society, the social incentives that are given to you, the punishments that are given to you that motivate you to act a certain way and form you a certain way, and the sorts of experiences you have as either a boy or a girl or a man and a woman. These are all under the broad umbrella of socialization. And these have a very significant effect on you. And yeah, so before you talk about sex difference, you have to realize that sex difference isn't this sort of, I guess, deterministic force that is just kind of all consuming, and that there are a lot of just social factors that play into this. And one of the easiest way to notice the effects of socialization is to look at, for example, autistic women raised in socially conservative spaces and autistic women raised in socially progressive spaces, and just the differences that you'll see between them, and the various ways that they will act as a result. And socialization does have a very significant effect. And there's this question of, what is nature, what is nurture, or how are you acting that is sort of a result of you being a woman, and how much of how you're acting is a result of how you were taught to be a woman. All these things are very complicated, and the very short answer is we can't separate these. We can't separate them very easily, and we can't meaningfully separate them and say this is definitely nature and this is definitely nurture. Pretty much everything is a complex mix of both, probably with different ratios for each individual person and for each individual thing. And so take a lot of what we're saying with a grain of salt. Just understand that what we're doing is we're talking about general trends and general patterns, not specific trends and specific patterns. Sex difference in autistic people is kind of difficult to talk about for a lot of reasons. And it's difficult to talk about because we tend to think of sex difference as sort of a bimodal distribution, with, generally speaking, each trait will be paired off on a spectrum with some overlap between the two sexes on the sort of smaller ends of the bell curve. But with autistic people, we tend more to not be a bimodal distribution and be like a multimodal distribution with lots of different peaks and lots of different places. And it's not always clear where you come up. And that is because autistic people don't respond to socialization the same way. And so some autistic people will respond normally to socialization like the rest of their peers will, and some of them won't respond to socialization very well at all. And the way that changes gender expression is pretty massive. And so what you'll usually get is you'll get people clustered based on how well they respond to socialization, based on their sex and gender. So, got a lot of questions about this, and so I'll just list some of the questions. The questions are autistic men different than autistic women when it comes to Christianity? The short answer is yes. The long answer is yes, but it's kind of complicated, and splitting autistic men and autistic women into those discrete categories on those lines probably isn't the best way to do classification. I say this because, for example, I'll just use myself so I'm not throwing anyone under the bus. I tend to be a lot closer to adult autistic women than I am adult autistic men. That's for a large variety of reasons, but this isn't because I'm like secretly feminine or anything like that. I don't think I have ever been accused of that, and I don't think I ever will be accused of that. But it's for a very wide variety of reasons. There are lots of autistic women that I'm not like, but there's a certain type of autistic women typically the type of autistic woman who is less empathetic and less emotionally engaged, and who are the cold, calculating, analytical type of autistic woman, I tend to be a lot closer to them than the male counterpart of that. And that is for no discernible reason that I can understand. And so I would even ask, is splitting autistic people by sex a useful thing to do? Or would it be better to talk about these sort of meta categories that typically fall along gendered lines, where there will be more women in one category than men in some clusters and more men than women in other clusters? Those definitely exist, and you can talk about these cluster groups and say this cluster group is predominantly male, this cluster group is predominantly female, or whatever. But just understand that this is really complicated, and this doesn't cleanly fall when you try to actually process the data. It doesn't cleanly fall into any continuous map or clean spectrum.
So that's the long answer.
Yeah, that's the long answer. But yeah, all that to say, there are sex differences. There are many exceptions to sex differences. So, just in case it wasn't clear, what we're about to talk about for males and females, or men and women, and how they tend to be different, there are many men who fall in line more with the female experience, and many women who fall more along the lines of the male experience. This does not mean they are the other gender. This just means that the expression of autism typically aligns with more people of the other gender. That's all that means. Don't read too much into this. So,
You're going to get emails that are like, you said this was a manly trait, but I'm a woman and I have
literally, no,
it.
I literally get emails about that all the time whenever I say anything. I'm an exception to this. It's true, you are. There are many exceptions to these things.
Right. Anyone
But
listening, if you're the
yeah,
exception, then we weren't talking about you.
correct. So, a few trends I will note though. When you look at the sort of where the bulk of men tend to fit, you will tend to find more autistic women who overlap with men than you do the other way around. So, that is to say, where there is overlap, there is a higher percentage of female overlap with typical male traits than there is male overlap with typical female traits. I don't know why this is. No one knows why this is. People give lots of answers for this, because these trends tend to show up in other populations as well. There are many good explanations for them, and there are many bad explanations for them. And quite frankly, I don't think anyone knows. I think we're mostly trying to guess. So I'm not going to speculate as to why that is the case. But like there are many examples that I can think of off the top of my head of autistic women who, after I interviewed them, if you were to take away all the gender stuff about them and anything they say, and if you were to line that up with the typical male interview, you would not be able to tell the difference. So that happens more with women than it does with men. Another thing to talk about, these tendencies that I've observed are mostly within Western English speaking people between the ages of 18 and 35. So this is where I've seen the most of it. I don't know if these trends hold in the Czech Republic or in China or in anywhere else that isn't English speaking Western countries. And another thing is that I've noticed is when I'm talking to people who are in the age 35 to 60 demographic, sex differences tend to be more apparent. That could be for a lot of reasons. Could be socialization, because typically people in that age category tended to grow up in a more conservative culture that put more emphasis on gender and gender roles. And so it just might be that people who were raised in a culture with a stronger sense of gender roles just have a more closer alignment with the sort of stereotypical idea of what an autistic man is or what an autistic woman is. That's that. Shared cluster traits. What are the overlaps? There are lots. If you want to learn about them, look at episode 8. We did a whole episode on what autistic Christians tend to look like, and that was mostly gender agnostic. If you would like to know about the many shared traits across sex differences, go to episode 8. That's where we talk about most of them. On that topic, I should also note, when we talk about sex differences, we set these things up as there are two categories, and so we often think they're very far apart. I haven't found that to be the case. I typically find that autistic men and women have more in common with each other than they do their neurotypical counterparts. So autistic men will often find autistic women more relatable than non-autistic men, and autistic women, same thing. But yeah, just keep all of those caveats in mind before we talk about this. Okay, hopefully we've said enough that we don't get canceled. So,
20 minutes of disclaimers wasn't enough.
I hope 23 minutes of disclaimers and caveats were enough to explain that this is whatever. Well, we're just going to send it. So, autistic male tendencies. So, in general, autistic men, when compared to autistic women, are significantly less emotionally engaged. They tend
That's
to be
crazy.
significantly harsher. Oh, yeah. Surprising if you've ever met an autistic man. They tend to be significantly harsher, significantly less empathetic, and significantly less motivated by compassion than their autistic female counterparts. If you want to be told that you are a stupid and worthless person, say something that is like slightly theologically wrong near an autistic man on the internet, and he'll let you know.
Yeah.
Like it just is what it is. Like, I've been in these spaces for like almost a decade, and it's just easily observed. Autistic
But who
men
among
tend to
us
be. Oh,
haven't done
go ahead.
that? I mean, who among us hasn't done that, though?
Yes, who amongst us? Yeah, autistic men tend to be a lot more focused on details, specifics, and minutia, especially when it comes to theology. They will care a lot more than the average autistic woman about the differences between transubstantiation and consubstantiation, and like the very specific theology of the Eucharist. Not to say autistic women don't care about that. There are
No,
many who do.
that's not a detail. That's an important thing. I'm out here, whatever.
Yeah, okay. You were about to learn that Maddie is one of those autistic Christian women that tend to have more overlap with autistic Christian men. Autistic Christian men are often less focused on real world pragmatic impacts of their ideas and their theology, and more focused on theoretical impact and theoretical correctness and things like that. And being technically correct is more important than like being nice or those types of things. They tend to be more heavily skewed towards like scientific analysis of theology, and less interested in the sort of humanities approach to theology. They tend to be very skewed. Like, when you look at the types of literature they consume around Christianity, it tends to be nonfiction, academic theology, academic history, that type of thing. They tend to be very systematic in their thinking.
Mhm.
And they are much more likely to directly argue with you, confront you, and engage in debate. Like, they will look for it, and they'll go for it.
It's a fun
It is like a lot of them, like their social emotional bonding is through finding disagreements with people and explaining why they're wrong.
absolutely.
Yeah, there tends to be a really low emphasis on aesthetics. So it's very rare to find an autistic. Well, it's not very rare. I should re-say that. It's more rare to find an autistic man who has a fully defined theology of beauty. There tends to be a much higher emphasis on information gathering and information processing with autistic men. Them gathering their data and gathering their facts and things like that tends to be a lot more important for them. And there is also a much stronger skeptical impulse and a much stronger skeptical epistemology and methodology for deriving accurate information. Like, often I joke that a lot of autistic men are sort of, like, There's a joke that's, like, ah, yes, I'm a Christian with Lutheran characteristics. I often explain that autistic Christian men can sometimes be Christians with atheist characteristics, because they're often intensely skeptical and they'll pin you down, and they'll keep asking you questions even when you are long past the point of wanting questions asked to you, and be like, well, you're wrong about your theology. You can't say that. You don't know that. Why are you saying something that you don't know? Are you dumb? Overall, that's what autistic males are like when compared to autistic women.
They're fun.
Yeah, they are certainly, I mean, and I amongst them. so
You're fun.
so I mean, some may debate that, but yeah, autistic women, generally speaking, just tend to be like, I don't know, better people. To say, like they tend to be a lot more empathetic, conscientious, kinder, gentler, accepting, with some exceptions, and more considerate of others. Autistic women in general tend to be easier to be around. They tend to be more agreeable and more willing to look for common ground. Whereas when you talk to an autistic Christian man about theology, he'll be looking for what you said accidentally wrong. Whereas when you talk to an autistic woman about theology, they'll often look for common ground for you to agree and build up on. In general, they tend to be more normative. And by that, I mean closer to the average Christian in their denomination. So autistic men tend to be farther than the average Christian in their denomination than autistic women. Autistic women will tend to seem a lot more normal. They tend to be significantly more emotionally sensitive and aware of others and aware of others' needs. They tend to be a lot more aware of various social things and like systemic injustice and those types of things. There is a much heavier emphasis on aesthetics in a lot of autistic women's Christian practices. So, aesthetics, ritual, and praxis are often much more important parts of autistic women's theologies than they are men. Autistic men tend to be focused on, I need to get the facts right and I need to get the things right. Whereas autistic women will be a lot more focused on the aesthetics, the ritual, and the actual like praxis of the religion. Art, music, fiction, literature tend to feature significantly more heavily in autistic women than in autistic men. You pretty much never find autistic men writing religious fan fiction. You find lots of autistic women writing religious fan fiction or writing religious fiction novels. Autistic women generally have less regard for hierarchy within the church. They will tend to have a significantly heavier emphasis on a sort of experiential mysticism and engagement with mysticism, and much more engagement on issues of social activism than autistic men, and a lot more interested in general in Christian sexual ethics. A lot of autistic men will sometimes think about sexual ethics. It is very rare to find an autistic Christian woman who hasn't thought a lot about sexual ethics. And
Yeah.
finally, one really significant feature that I have noticed is autistic women are significantly more likely to be openly misandrist than autistic men will be openly misogynist. Misandry, for those who don't know, is a distaste or hostility towards men. Misogyny is a distaste or hostility towards women. It is very common for autistic Christian women to be openly misandrist or to say, I kind of hate men, or something like that.
They don't
It
say it
is,
like that,
they don't
though.
say it like that. They say it like that when they're comfortable with you, but they will typically express a distrust or a hostility towards men in a way that you typically don't find autistic Christian men displaying that. Now, you do find some autistic Christian men who do that, especially like on the sort of incel alt-right adjacent side of the autistic
Yeah.
Christian sphere. However, it is very common for your sort of normie autistic Christian woman to be like, I don't really care for men, or have an attitude of sort of every man is a threat until proven good. Whereas autistic men will typically have a much more neutral approach to gender and sex, where autistic women will sort of, for a lot of reasons, have a more adversarial relationship to the gender wars, I'll say.
Yeah, I've never heard an autistic man say something along the lines of we should take all the women and remove them from society until they can prove that they're worthy of rejoining civilization. But I've heard the
Yeah,
opposite.
yeah, it's that is a fairly common sentiment. We should sequester men away from women until they prove that they aren't a threat, and then they can rejoin polite society.
Autistic men tend to be more like women are hard to talk to and I can't get a date.
Yes, yeah, that's more the autistic man complaint about women, whereas women are like, men are kind of a existential threat to my being, and I don't really feel comfortable with them. Which,
Two
fair
different
enough.
flavors. Yeah.
I'm not going to argue with them.
It's going to keep coming up. The
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
like,
That
men care uh, you know, gender and sexuality stuff, and the autistic women really care. So if you don't like that, don't listen to the upcoming questions or answers.
yeah. So we are going to say that a lot. So there is this sort of experience of gender that I'll talk about where autistic women, when I talk to them, seem very hyper aware of their gender, and they will often talk about their significant friction with gender roles and gender expectations. They'll report difficulties with being feminine and the feminine ideal and fitting into society's expectations for women. They will often report a very intense discomfort with the male gaze and male sexualization and male objectification. They will talk a lot about what it means to be a woman in a society with men, what it means to be a woman in a society or in a church with men, and what being a woman means versus what being a man means. You will find autistic women talk about that kind of stuff all the time and unprompted, just when they're just saying stuff.
Yeah.
That is what they will talk about.
Men, not so much.
Yeah. Autistic men, very little interaction with gender and sexuality unprompted, I'll say. If you prompt them and if you ask them, they'll probably come up with an answer. Sometimes the answer is kind of like whatever, it is what it is. Autistic men will often report having no real transcendent feeling of gender, but they'll be like, I don't really get the whole gender thing. I don't feel like a man. What does that even mean? Whereas autistic women have a lot more of a sort of tend to at least have a lot more of a visceral feeling of womanhood and what being a woman means. Autistic men will often be very apathetic about gender. They don't really care. They don't talk about it if it's unprompted. Often, though, if they also have experiences with something like gender dysphoria or they live in proximity to gender-based violence, so they know someone close to them was sexually abused, they will often share feelings about gender and things like that unprompted. But if those factors aren't there, typically not really a thing autistic men think about very much. Where it is this like ever present thing for a lot of autistic women. So, some other trends, aging tends to have a sort of crystallizing effect for men. So, as men age, they tend to sort of crystallize and stagnation's the wrong word, but they tend to associate a lot more with the male traits that you'll typically see. And you'll often see autistic men just moving further along the more extreme axis of that. I don't mean extreme in a bad way. They'll just become whatever they are, they'll become more like that. Whereas autistic women will often have a more of a cross pollination effect, where autistic women will often sort of move towards the middle more. especially like after age 35, that will tend to happen. With autistic women, it's kind of weird. They in the teenage years, they often feel a very intense discomfort with femininity and don't really like it. And then when they get into their 20s, they go through a more feminine shift, and then whatever happens after that is usually you can't predict it. Like they'll either go one way, or where they'll sort of either crystallize into a sort of hyper autistic femininity traits, or they will sort of cross pollinate significantly more than autistic men. And it's more common for autistic women to have male coded traits than it is for autistic men to have female coded traits. And significantly more autistic Christian women will have traits shared by the majority of males than males will have traits shared by the majority of females. I think this is mostly caused by socialization differences and just autistic women responding to socialization very differently to men, whereas women have to sort of confront negative socialization trends, whereas men don't really feel those effects, and so they don't really have to deal with them, so they just kind of go on whatever path they were already going down, whereas autistic women have more of a feeling that about it than men. There's a joke from a girl on Twitter named Lay Be Sassy, and she tweets a lot about various things, usually making fun of men for not knowing about Dutch theologians. I'm just kidding. She sometimes does that. But I had this series of tweets that I thought was quite funny on this, where she said, "We used to be able to cloister these intense theology-tism bros away in the desert or isolated monasteries in the mountains, but thanks to modernity, I have to see their takes literally every single day online instead." And then a follow-up tweet, she said, "Girltism theology, ecstatic beatific visions of the triune Godhead, divine love poured out, composing some of the earliest examples of Western music. Boytism theology, sorry, you made a crucial mistake of misunderstanding my niche doctrinal obsession. Have fun in hell." And yeah, I think that does a pretty good job of summating the general differences that you tend to see across sexes and the different trends.
Absolutely.
Do you have any questions or think I missed anything, or is there anything that you were wondering in particular when it comes to this?
I think you covered that pretty well. That's pretty good.
Sick. All right. Now we are going to talk about the, I don't know, more or less controversial topic, which is the autistic attitudes towards LGBTQIA plus
Oh, definitely
stuff.
less.
Yeah, just a content warning. We are going to be talking about homophobia here. Obviously, there are autistic Christians who are not supportive of gay people, and we will be explaining them and why they believe things.
That doesn't mean we believe that.
Yes.
Or maybe we do. You don't know.
No, this is not an endorsement of any views. This is a description of these views. We
Mhm.
have no beliefs. Actually, no, that's not true. We do have beliefs, and the beliefs are whichever ones you have.
Yes.
So,
Whatever you believe, that's what we also believe.
so
Don't
the
write emails.
yeah, don't email me telling me my views are wrong, or that someone else's views are wrong, because we hold your views, and so we agree with you perfectly. No, I'm
Mhm.
just kidding. What we're trying to do here is just describe what the positions are, not give an endorsement of any positions. So what we're trying to do is just say, these are the general positions. This is where autistic people tend to fall. So before we do that, we need to talk about terms. So
Mm.
in Christianity in general, we will use terms like side A or side B or side X or side Y. I don't love these terms. Now, these terms do describe something useful. I'm not denying they describe useful positions, but I prefer to use a different way of talking about it. So, the way I talk about being affirming or not affirming is a four axis approach. So you could think of you are affirming from a scale to 0 to 10 along these four axes. So social, civic, hermeneutic, and moral intuition. So those are the 4 axes that you are affirming again on. 0 would mean you would be the farthest away from affirming that you possibly can be. 10 would be you are the most affirming that you can possibly be along these axes. So what do they mean? So the social axes. If you are socially affirming, that means you are willing to be friends with, you're willing to work with, and interpersonally connect and form relationships with gay people with no real issues. These things don't bother you. You have gay friends. You would bake a cake for a gay wedding type of thing. You would go to you would go if your friends invited you to a gay wedding, you would go to it. You have no issue spending time with them. You you're completely fine with gay people socially, and you wouldn't feel uncomfortable around a gay person if you are. That's like what
That'd be
that
a
means to be
10.
socially affirming. Yeah, so a 0 would mean you don't like gay people at all. You find them uncomfortable, like a Westboro Baptist style. Um,
Right.
Not at all socially affirming. So civically affirming would mean you support legal protections and the government passing legal protections for gay people in various ways. So this would mean you are, for example, pro gay marriage if you are civically affirming, anti gay marriage if you are not civically affirming, or if you support, for example, in some countries there are penalties for being homosexual. That would be like a 0 on that axis, whereas supporting as many legal protections as you can think of as being the most affirming. And so the civic affirming is basically asking what sorts of laws do you think should be passed to either to protect or criminalize homosexuality. And if you are a big on the protect side, you would be on like the 10. If you are on the criminalized side, you would be a 0. So those 2 axes I typically call like the social axes. So those are not related to your orientation to the church. The next axes I typically call the theological ones. So these are hermeneutically affirming and theological and moral intuition affirming. So hermeneutically affirming means you believe that the biblical texts or church teaching can be interpreted in such a way that it supports LGBTQ people. It would, if you're hermeneutically affirming, you might say something like the Bible supports gay marriage, or church tradition supports gay marriage, being gay is not a sin, being in a sexual relationship with a member of the same sex is not sinful, that type of thing. That's what hermeneutically affirming means. You would be a 10 if you were like a maximalist. You would be a 0 if you were like absolutely not. There is nothing here that is supportive. You can't make a case for it. A 5 would be, I don't know. So it would a 5 would be kind of the middle position
Like
between
maybe
those.
there's
And
arguments for it, but
yeah, maybe
not
there's
like
arguments for it. Maybe there's arguments against it. I can't make up my mind on what the right position is.
right.
A 4 would be I understand the arguments for it. I understand the arguments against it, and I think the arguments against it are better than the ones for it. 6 would be, I understand the arguments. I think they're better than the ones against, type of thing.
Yeah. You may be hearing all of this and thinking that's a lot of steps to when you could just say I'm affirming or I'm not affirming. But autistic people like nuance.
Yeah. Not only do they like nuance, but they like telling you when you didn't properly capture their specific niche profile and how they would categorize themselves.
So
Yeah.
this is important.
This is why it's necessary to just not say affirming or not, because
Yeah.
yeah, we'll get into that. The final axis is moral intuition. So moral intuition is a sort of internal feeling on what you believe about like gay marriage or something like that. So it is possible to say hermeneutically, I can't justify this position, but in my heart of hearts, I don't believe God would ever condemn to hell a gay person who's in like a loving monogamous same sex marriage.
Mm-hmm.
or I don't think being gay is inherently sinful, and I just feel it deep inside me. And this is like a common thing autistic people will say. Often when they have LGBT friends, they'll be like, look, obviously nothing's going wrong here. These are good people and I like them and they're my friends. I don't think God would condemn them. I think God would love them like I love them, type of thing. So moral intuition is less about what you think the text says, but more what you feel is true about them and how you think God would feel about them. That's the sort of what is your internal moral intuition about these matters. A 0 would be like, Westboro Baptist style stuff,
My
and
moral
a 10.
intuition says it's wrong.
Yes, I have a moral intuition, and it is that 9/11 was punishment for homosexuality. That would be like a 0. Yeah, yeah, we did say that we hold whatever position that you hold. I will make an exception. We don't hold the position of the Westboro Baptist Church. If you are a member of that church and you're listening to this podcast, we don't agree with you.
Yeah,
However,
specifically, neither of us are Westboro Baptist, but
yes.
other than that, we agree with you.
So a 10 would be like you're fully affirming, like you don't think that being gay is a sin at all,
Right.
and you don't think that same sex relationships in any way are sinful, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I often get asked, how can you affirm things on a moral intuition side, but not on a hermeneutic side? And the way I do this is asking them their position on whether or not unbaptized babies go to hell, because there isn't a really great way to look at that question and answer it based on hermeneutics. Or you could read and you could say, well, I can see a case for it and I can not see a case for it, and church tradition teaches these things and I don't know, but like often people will say, I don't really care what the church teaches, I know that God would never condemn a baby to hell. And they have
Right.
this very deep strong moral intuition that even though I cannot hermeneutically prove something, inside me I have held my baby and I know God could not hate this child and God would not torture it forever because it's this innocent potato. God wouldn't punish an innocent potato.
Yeah. Was
Um,
that your thought?
that was my thought when I held my baby. It was
Oh,
very like autistic man holding a baby
innocent
and being like,
potato.
yes, this is a warm potato. Anyway, yeah.
So you might still think that it's inconsistent, but
Yeah.
like this, at least this isn't the only topic people will do that.
Yeah, so it is very possible for you to say, I recognize that I'm being inconsistent here. Like, I recognize that I don't think you can make a good case for being affirming out of the Bible, but just in my heart of hearts, I don't think God would condemn this. And so it's very possible to hold that attitude. I know quite a few people who do.
Mhm.
A yeah, what are autistic attitudes towards LGBTQIA plus people? Let's start with the easiest. I and A, so that is intersex and asexual. Amongst the autism community, there is near universal support and acceptance of intersex and asexual people. Discrimination or ire or overt condemnation of these people is extremely rare within the autism community across all political spectrums and across all denominations. The only exceptions I see to this are like weird autistic teenage boys who kind of just need to chill out a bit.
They
who
want a
who think that,
reaction. They're trying to get a
yeah,
reaction out of you.
yeah, they're mostly trolling other people, and they'll say things like, if you don't get married you're committing a sin or something like that. Then they're usually Protestant because they don't have a conception of like holy vocation or
That's
like
pretty fun.
being a consecrated virgin or something like that. Yeah, so those are the only cases where you typically see any sort of ill will towards them. There's a very high rate of asexuality within the autism community. If you're autistic, you probably know an asexual. If you're connected to autism communities, or if you know lots of autistic people, there's a high chance you know an asexual, and you'll be just like, no, I'm not going to condemn this person. This is stupid. And there's also really good hermeneutic support for asexuals, because Paul says in Corinthians, it would be better if you remained unmarried. But marriage is this sort of unfortunate exception that he's willing to make. But everyone should be unmarried for the sake of the kingdom. So autistic people overall have a very high support for asexual intersex Christians. In the crushing majority of cases, autistic Christians do not care about any of the counter arguments against these types of things, and will often be very strong advocates for them, and will fight against discrimination against them. Because
Mhm.
also, autistic people just tend to identify with kind of other atypical people. And so they'll typically have a really high tolerance for social nonconformity,
Mhm.
and so they'll often be very supportive of asexuals. Same thing with intersex. I have yet to meet an autistic person who thinks intersex people are bad or sinful or need to be dealt with in a certain way. The overwhelming attitude from autistic people is intersex people should just do whatever makes sense for them. There are a very wide range of intersex conditions. There's no real point in getting into it, because overall the attitude for autistic people is pragmatism. It is
Mhm.
do whatever makes sense and do whatever works. In this case, God loves you type of thing. And yeah,
Yeah.
so
The
that's the
pragmatism is like a recurring theme for the most part.
yeah. Yeah, we'll be talking a lot more about pragmatism as time goes on. Yeah, relative percentages of LGBT people. I got this question a lot. This is very heavily dependent on demographic information. So the
Mhm.
exact numbers are very hard to pin down. Obviously, in Christianity, I don't think it's controversial to say Christians have perhaps not always handled sexual orientation in a way that is accepting of non heterosexual sexual orientation. I think that's a fairly uncontroversial thing to say. And so, as a result, if you are not heterosexual, you will tend to hide that you are not heterosexual. And if you're hiding it, it's very hard to count you. You know, how many closeted gay autistics are there in the church? I don't know.
At least
And
two.
yeah, at least, no, I would say at least 15. I know for sure there are 15. You know who you are. But yeah, so the numbers are really hard to pin down. If you just go for headcount, autistics who are on social media and either I explicitly identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans, if you just go by headcount, the numbers are as follows: around 10% are lesbian, around 12% are gay, around 22% are bisexual, and around 18% are trans. Those numbers seem very high, and they are. A few things to keep in mind. Overall, in the general population, autistic people are overrepresented in the LGBT groups. Just in those groups in general, autistic people are, for whatever reason, more likely to also have a different sexuality than non autistic counterparts. I don't know why, and no one else really knows why. That's the short answer, because I know I'm
Yeah.
going to get, why does this happen? We don't know.
Nobody
Is
knows.
is the short answer. We don't know why people are gay, so I don't know why we would also know why autistic people are more likely to be gay. For some reason, some combination of biology and socialization, that's going to be my answer. So those numbers are higher than the general population. They are quite high in autistics. So, that being said, those numbers are probably inflated. And those numbers are probably inflated for a few reasons. One of the reasons is because most of the data that I've pulled is from the 18 to 35 age demographic, and
Mhm.
that age demographic tends to more commonly identify as LGBT than older age demographics. If I was able to pull better data from the 35 plus crowd, those numbers would probably go down. Two, there's a really significant biasing effect with a lot of autistic data collection, and I've tried to correct for it a lot, but still in that there is a lot of sampling bias. So within culturally conservative spaces, being diagnosed as autistic is more heavily stigmatized. So if you suspect you might be autistic, you are less likely to actively seek out a diagnosis. If you suspect your kid is autistic, you are less likely to actively seek out a diagnosis for them if you are culturally conservative. And even if you were to get a diagnosis, you are significantly less likely to openly identify as autistic. Many of the ways I find autistic conservative communities is by finding individual conservatives that I know are autistic and then mapping out their social networks, because autistic people have a tendency called, in general, there's this tendency called homophily, which basically just means that autistic, or that people in general, tend to attract like people, and they tend to sort of clump, and they tend to socially clump. And so I find a lot of autistic Christian conservatives by finding one autistic Christian conservative and then sort of finding everyone in their group, and that usually finds a bunch of other autistic people, which finds another bunch of autistic people. But anyway, I know from doing lots of surveys of those groups that just going by head count is probably going to overinflate those numbers, because these autistic people are overwhelmingly not identified as LGBT, but also overwhelmingly not self-identifying as autistic. Whereas people in more progressive and socially liberal spaces will be far more willing to openly identify as autistic. So, for example, if you look at the hashtag actually autistic, and then you look at the political affiliations of people who are hashtag actually autistic, overwhelmingly leftist and progressive. However, that doesn't mean that autistic people are overwhelmingly leftist and progressive. That just means people who use that hashtag also are overwhelmingly progressive. Anyway, so what I'm trying to express is those numbers that I just gave are probably overcounted, even when you account for closeting effects, because closeting effects typically don't affect progressives and liberals. They tend to affect conservatives, and conservatives are undercounted. And so overall, I think the numbers are probably higher than they actually are in reality. Another factor in the trans category, I said 18%. That is, as far as I know, accurate, again, with all the sampling biases, so it's probably a little overinflated. Autistic people are disproportionately trans when compared to their non-autistic counterparts. But also, a lot of those trans people also identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. You shouldn't add all those numbers together. If you add the LGB together, you get about 34%. Again, probably a little overinflated. Trans people, if you add trans people, it would be like 34.3%, because the vast majority of those are going to identify as LG or B. Those are the numbers. That is, as far as I can tell, what the general state of the ground is. Another question I get a lot. I mean, I get so many questions about trans people. I don't know why I get so many questions about trans people, but everyone wants to know, because lots of people talk about links between autism and trans stuff, and people are like, this is a hot button culture war issue. Let me ask the guy who studies autistic people. Like I said, we will be covering these things in a different episode, not this one. However, one trend that I think is worth mentioning here is the relative percentage of trans women and trans men compared to relative percentages of cis women and cis men within Christianity. The numbers are really hard to pin down. Relative numbers of autistic trans men versus autistic trans women in the general population is not known, but as a general rule, trans women are significantly more common than trans men. And that is for whatever reason. Not going to get into why. It just is what it is. If you do a head count, there are going to be more trans women than there will be trans men, especially if you include trans non-binary or non-binary identified. So if you include non-binary identity, you will still get more trans women than you will trans men. By head count, though, if I'm just looking at my own numbers, the number of autistic Christian trans women that I've identified is significantly higher than the number of trans autistic men that I've identified. That being said, still know a few trans autistic men. It's just when I look at numbers, the majority of them in head count would be autistic women. And when I say majority, I mean 90%. So,
That is
yeah, it's a very large majority. That is probably for a lot of reasons. It's a little too complicated to get into with me not knowing how to choose my words right at this moment for speculation reasons. But yeah, there are a lot of factors that feed into why that might be. But if I just go strictly by head count of how many people I know are trans women and how many people I know are trans men and put them all in a pool of trans people and randomly select them, there will be a 90% chance that they will be a trans woman rather than a trans man. Keep in mind, my data pool is quite large, and so that doesn't mean that trans men aren't statistically significant, or I haven't found enough that I can give data on them. I think I can. It's just that trans women are significantly more common in the autistic Christian online spaces that I am surveying. Hey everyone, editing John here. Listening back to this, I realized that I forgot to define terms just to make sure people aren't confused. Trans woman means that they have transitioned to become a woman. Trans man means they have transitioned to become a man. So that would mean a trans woman was born male but has transitioned to a woman, and a trans man is someone who is born female and transitions to a man. Just thought I'd clarify that in case anyone was confused. Any questions about numbers?
no. I think the numbers line up.
Great.
Good job.
So,
Sharing numbers is easier than describing graphs.
yes. So, another question I get asked is why do you count gay people as Christian? You can't be gay and Christian. Like,
Sorry.
why are you? Yeah, I mean, I'm always kind of just like,
Oh, yeah.
okay, just first of all, calm down. Just let's turn the homophobia knob down like 4 notches before we start talking about this.
No, that's an
Um,
opinion. You're not allowed to have one of those.
oh, true. Let's turn the knob of your feelings down like 3 or 4 notches, and then let's have this discussion.
Yeah. You're just collecting
So,
numbers. Why,
yeah,
it's you don't get to make
many
those calls. You're just the numbers guy.
exactly. Many people will tell me you can't be gay and Christian, so you shouldn't count those people as Christian. And to that I say, I don't really care about your opinion. And I mean that in the most sincere way. As far as I'm concerned, I'm not going to bother arguing about this. I think it's pointless. If a person comes to me and says, I'm a Christian and I'm also gay, my response to that is not, no, you're not a Christian. My response is to mark that down on a sheet and be like, interesting, tell me more. That is how I respond to this. I'm not interested in gatekeeping Christianity and saying you can be a Christian and you can't be a Christian. I am a layperson in the Anglican Church. My job is not to theologically police the other laity. That's just not at all how any of these things actually work. As far as I'm concerned, what I am doing is documenting people who call themselves Christian. If in your heart you want to say these people aren't actually Christian, I can't stop you, but I also don't care because they think they're Christian. And that's all I really care about. So if you
That's
think
what
you're
we're looking
Christian
for.
and you practice Christianity, if you show that you are a sincere, professing, and practicing Christian, and you also say that you're gay, I will say cool and just mark it down on a sheet so I can collect more of my demographic information about autistic Christians.
Yes,
I
as
that's
it should
that's
be.
that's what I do. I don't care about whether or not you think they can be Christian. They think they can be, and that's really the only question that I care about.
You're not the Pope, you're just some nerd.
Exactly. I am a nerd who likes studying autistic Christians. So if you say that you can be gay and Christian and that you are, I'll say, cool, good enough for me, and move on. I'll probably actually ask you to explain to me how you came to those conclusions and then your reasoning and support, because I also want to categorize that data. But I'm not going to argue with you about whether or not you're actually Christian. As far as I'm concerned, you are because you told me you are. Um, and until someone makes me a pope or a priest, I am going to continue to have that position. And, when they make me the Protestant pope, hopefully right after Francis, I'll be next in line for the seat. With that tangent out of the way, let's talk about relative rates of LGB acceptance in autism. So, specifically, we're just going to talk about LGB acceptance here because trans issues, again, get a lot more complicated and the demographics shift, and demographics shift along gender lines more significantly than they do in LGB acceptance. We're just going to talk about that for this episode. And recall the four axes that we're talking about when we're talking about affirming. We're just going to use that model because it allows me to better capture the mood. From everything I've been able to compile and all the people I've been able to find, and I have been actively trying to correct for the conservative sampling bias or progressive sampling bias that we talked about, around 85% ish would be over a 5 on the social and civically affirming axis. More would be over a 5 on the civically affirming than on the socially affirming, but in general, around 85% of autistics would be socially and civically affirming, which is to say, if you just sample an autistic population, they are more likely to be higher than a 5. The picture gets way more complicated when you talk about the hermeneutic and moral intuition axes. If you ask about all the axes combined, how many of them would, generally speaking, be over a 5? It would be around 65%, affirming around the moral intuitive axis and hermeneutic axis. If you say you have to strongly agree or strongly disagree, you would go down. If you say, okay, you can't really sit on the fence on this one, you've got to pick a side, that number drops from 65 to around 40 when you're talking just about the moral intuition and hermeneutic axes. So the sides that we talk about, like side A, side B, side X, and side Y, these are, we should probably define them first. So side A means fully affirming. So side A believe that same-sex marriage is not a sin, that same-sex sexual relationships within the context of a homosexual marriage is not a sin, being gay isn't a sin, being a lesbian isn't a sin. Side A is the fully affirming position that you would expect to find amongst progressive Christians. Side B is the idea that it's okay to be gay, it's cool to be gay, it's not okay to act on your gay feelings, which is to say, you shouldn't try to do conversion therapy. There's no point in trying to not be gay. Side B would say that the only legitimate context in which you can have sex without sinning would be in the context of a heterosexual monogamous marriage. And if you are gay, what you should do is be celibate.
Mhm.
And side B is usually spends a lot of time talking about how we need to be very supportive of gay people in the church and to
Mhm.
help them live celibate lives, and that they are simply not called to engage in sexual relationships if they are unable to do it with a person they are married to who is of the opposite sex. Side Y would basically hold to the same idea as side B, except side Y would usually say you shouldn't identify as gay. You should identify as same sex attracted. You shouldn't acknowledge that you have a gay sexual orientation. They wouldn't accept that category. They would say you're experiencing unwanted feelings of same sex attraction and things like that. Basically, side Y is the more conservative side of side B, if you want to think about it that way. Yeah, that's side Y. And then side X is like the pro conversion therapy side. So side X is all the things that side B and side Y is, but they take it even further and they say not only should you not identify as gay, you should actively try to become X gay. Like you should go through conversion therapy. You should not be gay. Like you should be heterosexual, and you should take all available ways of being heterosexual and just go down that path. So those are the sides. If you ask an autistic person to say you need to take a side, like you force them to take a side, the most autistics, and when I say most, I mean 51% type of margins, would say side A. The next highest percentage, at like 35-ish, would be side B. The remaining like 10% would be side Y, and then the remaining 5% would be side X. And that's kind of how it breaks down. So the majority would still be affirming if you force them to take a side, but by a sort of slimmer margin. If you don't make them pick a side, and if you say just mark where you would be along these axes, the majority would be fully affirming along all axes. Well, the majority would be above a 5 on most axes. So just by head count, most autistic people would mark more 5s than they would 4s, or more numbers above 5 than they would under 5. If you only look at the social and civic axes, you will find it's very high. If you so the majority that you would find would say above 5 on all axes. The next most common position would be above 5 on social, civic, and moral intuition, but below 5 on hermeneutics. What that means is they would say they're above a 5 on the social side, so they're fine with gay people socially. They're fine with laws being passed to protect gay people. Morally, they don't feel like gay people are inherently sinful or bad, or that they're going to hell, but they also can't find a good hermeneutic to justify it, or they think the hermeneutics for justification are weaker than the hermeneutics for being against it.
Mhm.
So that's the next most common position.
Autistic people like being right. So,
Yes, that's basically it. And autistic people are also quite literalistic in their interpretations, and their hermeneutic style just tends not to lend itself to hermeneutic affirming. I mean, I should say again, the majority would be on the hermeneutically affirming side of 5, but the next most common would be not on the hermeneutically affirming side of that. So that's the second most common position. The third most common position would be affirming along the social and civic axes, but not along the moral and hermeneutic axes. And then the least common position would be affirming along none of the axes, or only begrudgingly affirming on the civic axes. And that's often because they're like libertarians or something like that. And or they just have a political theory where they don't believe the state should be involved in making decisions about marriage, something like that. Again, from the top, most would be above 5 on all axes, and by most I mean like 51%. The next most common is social, civic, and moral, but not hermeneutic. Then social, civic, but not moral or hermeneutic. Then none of the above. For the socially affirming axes, it's surprisingly common across the board. The only demographic that this isn't common in are very conservative autistics or autistics from very conservative contexts. Even within conservative circles, though, it's not uncommon for an autistic person to be still socially affirming, even if they are conservative. And the very easiest way to explain this is something called proximity sympathy. In sociology, that's basically talking about if you are closer to a group, you're less likely to want to be mean to them. Basically, you're less likely, you humanize them, you see them as people who are like you. And given that autistic people are disproportionately LGBT, if you are involved with any autism groups, or if you hang out with autistic people, or you know autistic people online, you are probably friends with at least one gay person. And so you'll typically just, by the default forces of social pressure, be more likely to be socially affirming, even if you're on the more conservative side.
Mhm.
And there's also just autistic people tend to have a very default high tolerance for social deviation and for social nonconformity. For a variety of reasons, autistic people often don't care about people who don't conform. And so many of the sort of negative pressures that are in more conservative circles, autistic people don't really buy into a lot of those. And so they'll be like, you know, I don't really care if they're not conforming to the norms of what we should be doing. Doesn't really affect me, so I don't really care. And yeah, so that's socially affirming. So if you find an autistic person and you ask them their feelings, or an autistic Christian, and you ask them their feelings on LGB people on the social axis, they'll probably be like, yeah, they're fine. And yeah, that's just how it is. Along the civically affirming axis, again, surprisingly common amongst autistics of all persuasions. The only exceptions are people who are politically conservative and have a sort of idea that the state should be involved in policing a certain form of morality, and it'll be the morality that they hold to. And so that's pretty much the only time you'll get that. By default, autistic people often have this like really strong insistence that things need to be fair and equal. And I don't mean this as in a they're just great people. Often, this there's this video of like monkeys being fed grapes or nuts, and like monkeys love grapes. And there's this video of scientists feeding one, like getting a monkey to do a task and feeding it nuts, and then getting another monkey to do a task and feeding it grapes. And the monkey that got fed the nuts just loses its mind, shaking the cage, and is really mad. And I often say that if those monkeys were autistic, the one that got the grape would start shaking its cage, getting really mad because the other one should have got grapes as well. So even like to our detriment, we will often be insistent on fairness and equality, even if we don't like it,
Yeah.
or if it doesn't suit us. We'll be like, no, fair is fair, and if this applies to me, it also needs to apply to you.
And it's usually like the individual's perception of fairness.
It is all also the individual's perception of fairness. So this is also where a lot of incel logic comes from, by the way, is
Yeah.
the autistic insistence on fairness, but just applied to how an autistic man sees gender dynamics, not really considering how a woman might think of or see gender dynamics. And so, yeah, again, the insistence on fairness and equality isn't like a positive pro social force. It's just like a desire that things be level across the board. And so when it comes to civically affirming, that's the reason I suspect it's unusually high for Christian populations. So the socially and civically affirming are significantly higher than the average Christian. So when you look across all denominations and all political persuasions, autistic people are more likely to be affirming on those axes than non-autistic people. And I think those are the two reasons why. So now we get to the more controversial part, hermeneutically affirming. So this is the question I have gotten a lot. So I mentioned in the main podcast that autistic people tend to be more inclusive of gay people. And a lot of people were like, why? Justify yourself. And I'm like, whoa, whoa, calm down. I was saying autistic people. I cannot speak for all autistic people. However, what I can do is tell you what they told me. And basically, what I did is take the answers I got and split them into three categories for the hermeneutically affirming side. And so typically, when you ask an autistic person, are you affirming of gay people? And they say yes. And you say, this is not a position that has historically been held by the church. And this is often not how most Christians interpret the Bible. So, how do you read the teachings of the church or the Bible in such a way that supports this position? Or do you? And usually I get one of three answers. So, the first answer is what I call the biblical authority enjoyer. So, this first answer is typically held by autistics who have a very high view of scripture, who are usually theologically orthodox or put a heavy emphasis on orthodoxy. They are usually describe themselves as inclusive orthodox or something like that. And their argument will go something like this. And I'm condensing it for the sake of this podcast. This isn't a podcast about just this. So I understand I won't say every point that you would typically say. Don't email me about nice stuff, not stuff I get wrong. Anyway, the argument goes like this: the understanding of sexual orientation that we have in the Bible is not the understanding of sexual orientation that we had today. Ancient sexuality is very different from modern sexuality, and the way that we think of and conceptualize same sex relationships is completely different from how they did when the Bible was written. So, what is being explained in the Bible and what is being condemned in the Bible is not homosexuality per se, but instead it is sexual dynamics that are abusive and exploitative. They aren't talking about same sex sexual relationships in the context of a loving, monogamous same sex marriage. They are talking about same sex relationships in the context of pederasty or temple prostitution or sexual dynamics between a slave and a master. They aren't talking about two loving, consenting adults in marriage. And that wouldn't really be a concept that they would have thought of because in the ancient world, sexuality, as we understand it, like homosexuality, wasn't a thing. What was the thing was a attitude toward the active partner and the passive partner in sex. And the idea was if you were the active partner, it was fine, whatever you did. So a person would not be considered gay if they were the active partner. I mean, they wouldn't even be considered gay if they were. Like, gay wasn't a term they would use. But what's being described in the Bible is not what we think about as sexual orientation. And so when we read the Bible, we are not supposed to be reading in our modern categorizations of sexuality into what they're saying. What these Christians are condemning are genuinely bad and exploitative practices of their day. And so what's being condemned is exploitation and abuse, not two gay guys that love each other and have committed to marriage for life. And so
Right.
they will say, because the Bible isn't condemning same sex sexual orientation, what we need to understand is what marriage is supposed to be. And marriage is supposed to be this covenanted relationship. And in this covenanted relationship, sex and gender at the time were male and female because that's the only way that they conceptualized marriage, but that need not be the only way we conceptualize marriage. And so the biblical authors aren't condemning it, and the idea that they were trying to explain when they were explaining marriage would be one that would fit a monogamous same sex committed couple. So that's their argument. If you want to look more into these arguments, like the Reformation Project has a lot of the argumentation that they would typically go down. So you typically don't see arguments that differ significantly from those from this group of people. The next argument that they give is one of trajectory. So sometimes people who give the biblical authority argument will also give a trajectory argument, which is saying something like, while some forms of same sex relationship are condemned in the Bible, we should also understand the Bible as being a moral trajectory towards the expansion of God's mercy. And this expansion originally didn't include Gentiles, for example, and then it did. It didn't include one group of people, and then it did. And what we should understand is we see God's mercy widening, and there's a book exactly by that title called The Widening of God's Mercy, Sexuality Within the Biblical Story by Richard and Chris Hayes. It was recently published, that does the best way of explaining this argument. And it kind of goes like this. The biblical authors talked about things like slavery and anti-Semitism and stuff like that. And then in church history, we also accepted slavery and anti-Semitism and women being a subordinate class and things like that. But as time has gone on, God has revealed to us that these things are, in fact, not cool, and we should not be doing them. And the same thing should apply. We should just understand that God is trying to reveal to us these things about homosexuality. And we should understand that the trajectory of the Bible is towards including gay people, and so that we should include gay people. And that is the trajectory argument. You will often see that mixed with type 1 like the type 1 biblical authority argument, and then the type 2 trajectory argument. There's another argument that you'll typically get. This one is almost exclusively by progressive Christians. You will typically not find this argued by the sort of inclusive Orthodox type, or the people who care a lot about orthodoxy in like the small o sense. And that would be the what I call hermeneutics are pointless enjoyer. And this person would basically argue, look, the Bible says a lot of things, and a lot of these things are no longer relevant and they don't apply. And homosexuality is just another one of these things that is no longer relevant and doesn't apply. And the Bible says all sorts of things that are homophobic. It also says things that are sexist. It also says things that support slavery. It also says things that are anti-Semitic. It says a whole bunch of things that aren't good. We shouldn't be reading the Bible. We should be listening to Jesus. And what Jesus is telling us is that being gay is fine, and that being gay married is fine, and that theology and the way that we should be thinking about the Bible is through the lens of love and the expansion of God's love. And we should be thinking about inclusion and those left out on the margins. And yeah, that's basically the argument. So the argument, hermeneutics are pointless. We shouldn't do theology. And yeah, again, typically these are progressive Christians, and they will strongly emphasize that we should follow Jesus, not Paul, things like that. And Jesus didn't condemn homosexuality, and he talked about like selfless, self-giving love, and of course gay people are capable of doing that type of thing. Mm-hmm. So those are the three types of arguments that you typically get in support of hermeneutically affirming arguments. When a person is not affirming and you ask them why they're not affirming, on the hermeneutic axis, they will typically give the following argument. The Bible and church history is very clear, consistent, and overwhelming in its condemnation of homosexuality and same-sex sexual relationships. Christians have never been affirming until 50 years ago. I don't understand the justification for why. I can't find it in the Bible. I think the clobber verses in the Bible actually do apply to gay people, that type of thing. Yeah, the sort of standard church teaching for the last 2,000-ish years is typically what they'll point to. I don't know how to put that in a way that doesn't seem so blunt, but that's basically what it is. They will give you all the arguments that you would probably expect to find from Christians when they're condemning. same-sex marriage along hermeneutic lines.
I mean,
Another,
there's a reason that people asked you,
yeah,
why are people saying they can be gay and Christian and not? Why are the Christians not affirming of gay people?
yeah. So yeah, that's usually the response you'll get. More thoughtful autistics will often give another set of arguments. So you'll often get arguments about a developed theology of the body and what it means to be man and what it means to be woman and what it means to have sexual relationships within inside a specific Christian theological context.
Wow.
And
If
they will
only
say
a pope gave a series of lectures on that.
yes.
That'd be cool.
If only. Too bad that didn't happen and that
Too
the
bad.
Pope's authority is null and void. Uh, we're sedevacantists here, Protestant sedevacantists here on the podcast. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, so often Catholic autistics will point to a theology of the body and the whole Catholic theology of the body, and then how sexual relationships fit in there. And they'll basically say, look, same-sex sexual relationships don't fit into this theology at all. A lot of them will also say things like, look, we understand a lot of the clobber verses written in the New Testament and Old Testament aren't talking about modern conceptions of sexuality. We understand that. We don't think that what's being condemned in the Bible is a same sex sexual relationship. However, although these things don't apply to modern sexuality, it doesn't matter whether or not they were addressing modern conceptions of sexuality, because Christian teaching on sexual ethics in the Bible and church history has been basically a binary choice between two options, and that is celibacy and monogamous heterosexuality in marriage with no exceptions. And so the computer engineering oriented ones who talk to me, who's also a computer engineer, will usually say Christian sexual ethics is a whitelist, not a blacklist, meaning Christian sexual ethics doesn't say what you can't do or doesn't list the things you can't do. It only lists the things you can do. And the things you can do are no sex or sex within a heterosexual monogamous marriage, and that's it. And
Yeah.
so they'll say, even though we know the Bible isn't, we know those verses aren't targeted at gay people as we understand them today, Christian sexual ethics still is not permissive of this because, again, they'll say things along the lines of, or try to get across the idea that Christian sexual ethics is inherently exclusionary, restrictive, and non-permissive, and it pretty much only makes an exception for heterosexual marriage.
Right.
And that's what you'll get.
Yeah. Lots of
So,
arguments all over.
yeah. So those are the arguments and the body of arguments that you'll typically get. Again, you will typically find more autistic people on the hermeneutically affirming side, and that's for a lot of reasons. A lot of them will specifically say they'll be very honest and they'll say, "I'm hermeneutically. I was not first hermeneutically affirming, but I became hermeneutically affirming because I was looking for a way to be hermeneutically affirming. I actively went looking for the answer because of my gay friends and my moral intuition that this actually was. There has to be a way that God would actually allow for this." And a lot of them will be pretty transparent that they were backwards, like rationalizing to get to this point, which,
Hmm.
it is what it is. I'm not going to pretend I don't backwards rationalize things. And if you're listening to this and you say I don't, you're wrong. You do. Everyone backwards rationalizes all sorts of positions. So I don't think, like, I'll often hear people saying, well, we can dismiss those arguments out of hand. And I just don't think you can do that. I don't think that's how it works.
Hmm.
Yeah, the moral intuitive axis, you will still find more autistic Christians on the affirming side of moral intuition than you will find ones who aren't on the side of moral intuition. And I always think that's a bit interesting. And I think the answer to it is really just proximity to gay people and having gay friends and seeing them, and often having gay Christian friends and seeing them and being like, okay, these people clearly are Christian. They are doing all the Christian practices. They're trying really hard, or I see the effects, that the negative effects that a lot of non-affirming theology has had on them, and I just don't want to be on that side. I don't think God wants them to be treated that way. I don't think they deserve to be treated that way. And it's sort of like, I know gay people and they don't seem bad, and I know gay Christians, and judging them by their fruits, they seem fine. And the pain and turmoil caused by the non-affirming side, I just can't see God wanting us to do that to those people. And the shame and the pain caused by the church because of their treatment of gay people is really bad. And I don't want to join the side that hurt my friends is a very common one. The justification for not being affirming along the moral intuitive axis is often, I'll emphasize, it is very rare for an autistic person who doesn't affirm the moral intuitive axis to say something like it's gross, or they're groomers, or they're dangerous, or they're coming for the kids. It's very rare for you to hear like these sort of Christian culture war talking points being thrown out. It is, however, very common for them to say something like, I believe that God has a specific design for humanity and sexuality, and this design for humanity and sexuality is the right way to live. And if you don't fall into this way, then you're doing things that are wrong in God's sight. And these have been clearly laid out, and there'll often be appeals, especially if they're Catholic, to ideas of theology of the body. Another argument that they'll put out is that Christian sexual ethics is a closed door. And if you start opening that door, it's a whitelist. And if you start adding exceptions to that whitelist, what is stopping you to opening up exceptions to other parts of human sexuality? Like, what about kinks or hookup, or like hookup culture, or polyamory, or visiting prostitutes, or things like that? And they're like, look, the reason that Christian sexual ethics is a whitelist is because of this sort of need to police human sexuality. And policing and restricting human sexuality is actually a good thing. And so we can't change the whitelist. Like it needs to stay the way that it is. And even though I don't harbor any animus toward gay people, I just think morally we should not allow exceptions to these rules that have been placed on Christian sexuality. And so that's usually the justification for not being affirming on the moral intuitive axis. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
So finally, along gender lines. So if you ask about affirming belief along gender lines, autistic women are more likely than autistic men to be LGB affirming, but usually not by statistically significant margins. Usually, depending on demographic, it's around 5 to 10% more likely. Women are about 5 to 10% more likely. It's 70% women, 60% men type of thing. In some demographics, that changes a lot more. So in some demographics, especially like left or progressive, autistic Christians, women are at 80 to 90% affirming along all axes, where men will be like 75 to 85% on the affirming side of these axes. And there are a few other effects, like many autistics in progressive spaces won't express if they're skeptical about being hermeneutically affirming. So if they're like,
Yeah.
I want to buy these arguments, but I just kind of can't, they won't express that. They won't express that out loud. They won't post it on their timelines. They won't post it on social medias. They won't say that in a discussion. So it's also really hard to tell. I know these attitudes do exist because once I develop a trust relationship with people, and once they kind of realize that sort of I'm emotionally dead inside, and I will listen to you say anything, and I won't be
Nothing they can
judgmental
say would
at
surprise
all.
you anyway. So
Yeah, and like at this point, there's literally nothing they can say that can surprise me, and there's nothing they can say that will be more shocking than the things I've seen in real life. So like after they kind of learn this about me, and they'll often learn that I'm very just neutral and non-judgmental and just want to hear what people say, they will occasionally express skeptical views that I wasn't expecting them to express. And often it'll be like after I've known them for a year or two, they'll be like, like when it comes to this, I'm just not sure about the hermeneutic case. That being said, I don't know how to judge these numbers just because these only come out from like anonymous surveys, and often in anonymous surveys they'll also lie on them. Like I will ask them, oh, did you select non-affirming in this anonymous survey? And they'll be like, no, I didn't, because like I didn't want to give the impression that I wasn't, because I didn't want to make it seem like autistic people weren't hermeneutically affirming, because I would hate for an autistic friend of mine who is gay to see that and go, oh, look how many autistic people don't agree with this. And I was
That's
like,
so funny.
I understand that logic, but I hate you. Please
What
just
a
answer
terrible
honestly.
approach.
Yes. Please
That's
just
not how you take a
answer
survey.
honestly on the anonymous surveys. Like I literally don't track the data for it. But so that being said, it's very hard to track down exact numbers. I don't know how many there are. I do know this phenomena exists because it has happened far more than once. Like it has happened quite a few times once people get to know me and they're more willing to open up and talk about these topics. Yeah, it is more likely that they will express skepticism along the hermeneutic line than any other axis, and I have not noticed any trends that differ from men and women. So men and women in sort of equal numbers will slowly express to me that sometimes they don't find these things as convincing as they would like to. Oftentimes they're asking me for what resources would you recommend that would help me to be convinced of this topic, and they're looking for resources and questions and lectures. And sometimes people describe me as like a CIA operative in a war between two rival factions, that where I'll just give like ammunition to any side who asks me without really thinking about who I'm giving guns to or why.
That's true. That's real.
where they'll be like, I want like, what are arguments in support of this? And I'll be like, here, have resources, and not really. And oftentimes, you will find this if you message me and ask me directly, what do you think about this? I will often never say, this is what I think about this. I'll say, this is what other people think about this. And then I will give you resources about that.
You
Because
have
I
no opinions.
Yes, because I often take this approach in my work and in my research, I do find people on the progressive side will occasionally express certainty or express uncertainty. However, if you just look at trends over the years, it is significantly more likely for an autistic person to shift from non affirming to affirming along the hermeneutic axis than it is for them to go back the other way. That being said, it still does happen. But if you're looking at overall trends and trajectories, I would say over the next few years, you are probably going to find more people becoming more hermeneutically affirming than you are going to find more people going from hermeneutically affirming to not hermeneutically affirming. Other trends in this, so this should be unsurprising, but I'll just say it anyway in case it needs saying. If you belong to an explicitly affirming denomination, you are significantly more likely to be an affirming autistic. So if you are like Episcopal Church or Anglican Church of Canada or like United Methodists or United Church of Christ or whatever, if you are in a church that flies a rainbow flag outside of its door or has it on its website, you are significantly more likely to be affirming. If you are in a non-affirming denomination, it will vary a lot. So if you are in a non-affirming denomination that is politically coded as right-wing, there will be a very low acceptance across the board. But if you're in a non-affirming denomination that is not politically affiliated or not associated with a specific political attitude, there will typically be a much higher rate of acceptance than there will be of or a higher rate of affirming than there will be of non-affirming. So if the church doesn't hold an official position of it, but isn't very like involved in the culture wars or things like that, autistic people will typically be more affirming than not. So that's all for now. So those are all my answers to as many as of your questions as I think I could get. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Do
we
you have
covered.
any?
I don't think so. I think that was good.
Okay, cool. We will be back for another episode, which will
Yes.
be about abortion and women's ordination.
Yeah.
Uh,
So if
the,
you had hate mail,
yeah,
save it
yeah,
for our other topics.
yeah, yeah. So if you are planning on angrily emailing me, just wait until the next 2 episodes release and save all your angry emails for the last one.
Put
Uh,
it all in one email.
yes, yes. Put all your grievances in one email. Great. Okay.
Excellent.
Uh, See you later. I'm John, and this is Maddie. You can find me at christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com if you want to send me an email. If you want to find me on Twitter, you can find me at ChristianityOn and Blue Sky at ChristianityOn. Maddie, do you want to plug your socials or not?
Yeah, I'm at Fickle Frontier on Twitter. I go by Bronzer over there. And you should only send me your angry DMs and only send nice ones to John because he did a good job.
Yep. Or any like theme park related DMs or
Oh,
maybe
yeah, theme park
musical
stuff.
DM.
What?
Musicals and
Yeah.
musicals, maybe? Are you a
Musicals?
musical artist?
Yeah, I am.
I was going to say, you seem like a musical artist. Anyway, I think that's good for now. We will see you in the next episode to talk about more controversial topics that I didn't want to address in the main podcast. Yep.
Yay.